Welcome to Educators Podcast, a podcast dedicated to budding medical educators. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as intensive care specialist in Sydney, and it's my honor and privilege to have one of the very well-known celebrities in med world from Canada on today's show. His name is Professor Dan Pratt from Vancouver, who is Professor Emeritus of Adult and Higher Education in the Department of Educational Studies and holds a cross appointment to the Faculty of Medicine in the Center for Health Education Scholarship. Welcome, Prof.
Oh, thank you, Swapnil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining. Now, Prof, in your research, you have explored variations in teachings and learnings across disciplinary traditions and professional contexts. What things make health professional education so unique?
Very reasonable question. Having worked across a great many different professions in adult education and higher education, I think the major difference is context. And it comes down to a challenge for, especially in clinical settings, I think, for people to try and find a way to deal with all the demands and responsibilities that are clinical and still fulfill their educational roles and responsibilities. I think, for example, I hear all the time, and I'm not an MD, so I've observed in a lot of different settings. I've observed a lot in the operating room because I worked in orthopedics for 10 years and in emergency rooms. And the priority of caring for patients is number one, always. But interacting with other health professionals is part of daily routine. And in emergency particularly, but I think other things too, doing on ward rounds and things, the unpredictable is part of the day as well. So I think the material demands of entering, reviewing data on patients, taking care of them, competes with, oh yes, and I've got a learner with me, and sometimes multiple learners at different levels. So I think it comes down to context. Context is the thing that makes health professions education unique. In fact, I think I would argue, and I have argued, that for health professions, context is the teacher, and educators are supposed to facilitate that process of learning in context. That's why we send them out on rotations so often.
I guess you nailed it. I like the two things in this answer. One is, as you mentioned, about the unpredictability of our profession and the multiple learners at various levels. And I think we are all grappling with that challenge in our own individual disciplines. What are your insights onto those problems, and how do you think are we doing on those fronts?
Well, I think it's hard to know how we are doing on all fronts on this. Residents routinely say they're not getting feedback, and yet attendings say they are giving them feedback. So there's problems there. But I think, let's say, working with multiple learners at different levels, early on, someone told me that and he was an intensivist, he worked in intensive care, and he said, I always work up the ladder, never work down the ladder. By that, I think he meant you never start by asking the senior resident that's with you a question. You start lower so that the senior resident is never embarrassed. And so that requires time. That principle of not embarrassing the more knowledgeable or higher leveled student with you is a good one. But I think it also intrudes on time, because if you're really, the other thing I've heard others do and watch them do is to simply give the case over to the senior and then back away and do whatever you need to do for a while, but come back in and then ask that person to tell you how they've handled the different things. There's a woman who has worked a lot in emergency medicine, and she's got a theory of how it is that emergency docs work around this apparent chaos, but it's not chaotic from her point of view. So I think a lot of people figured out their context, and then they figure out how to attend to the learners within that context.
I agree, and I exactly do the same thing that intensivist does. I agree with the terminology chaos. We call it as a controlled chaos in intensive care,
Mm,
but I don't think we can get rid of the chaos due to the nature of unpredictability. Now, one of the key
yeah,
messages of your research is that effective teaching is cultural, situational, and personal. Can you tell us more about it?
sure. Let me start with the personal and then work my way up to cultural. For me, teaching is a very personal act. We teach as much who we are as what we know. And if anybody is in the room watching, we are teaching, especially if they're learners. So in doing so, we reveal ourselves, sometimes as fallible. And it's hard not to be fallible if you're doing the kind of work you do because there's so many uncertainties. But part of teaching who you are is teaching about the uncertainty and recognizing that you don't have all the answers all the time. So it's a very personal thing. In fact, I think one of the most important things for early educators to learn is to be true to themselves and not try and be someone else. Teaching who you are is what they're there to learn. And so I think that's the personal side of it. Situational is something that very few people that I've seen in faculty development seem to recognize. Teaching is a very situational thing. Nothing ever seems to go exactly as we plan it. And so the idea that teaching can be learned as a set of discrete skills and then aggregated to form some skilled teaching is naive at best. Skilled teaching requires that we be truly in the moment or in the situation, granted. But at the same time, a really good teacher has a third eye, watching the situation, the larger picture of that situation for patterns that may have been unexpected or may be critical, may be useful as a teaching moment, or they may need to take it back from somebody, take the moment back from someone learning to do so. So I think there has to be a situational awareness, but there also has to be situational ingenuity. When we see things like that, we've got to step in and invent new ways to respond to those emergent patterns in the situation. That's the third eye, seeing, oh, this isn't going the way I wanted it to. What do I do? And seeing it is one thing, interpreting it is another, and then deciding what should I do is yet a third part of situational awareness. So it requires this dual ability to lose yourself of teaching and at the same time maintain an awareness of what is going on in the larger picture. So that's situational awareness. Cultural it could also be called cultural awareness because teaching is also a cultural act. Culture for me is the cauldron or the vessel or the pot or whatever in which everything is formed. Now, I've got data to show that there's a culture of orthopedics, there's a culture of family practice, there's a culture of emergency medicine and so forth, and of nursing and other health professions. And within the culture of one's specialty, you're learning the language, you're learning a professional identity, you're learning about relationships and power in those relationships, authority, if not power, and even forms of reasoning. So as a consequence, it's also the place in which everything is normalized. The culture is normalizing a whole bunch of things, making clear as to what is to be done, how it is to be done. For example, learning what is the right thing to do in a confusing situation medically for the right reason and in the right way is not prescriptive. It needs to be guided by something that was learned in the culture, but not just routinely treated. So that goes into a level of consciousness and behavior that is often unquestioned because it's just the way things are done here. But the personal and situational dimensions of teaching are part of the professional culture that we represent. I think that's why it's important to reflect upon the norms that we've adopted. We've been acculturated into those taken for granted aspects of our specialty. Intentionally or not, we're passing those norms on to the learners along with a professional identity. So those are the three.
I think that three important messages for me: that be vulnerable or embrace the uncertainty, look at the large picture, and be flexible to adapt according to the situation,
Mm-hmm.
and adopt the norms of your tribe, what we call it tribal culture within the health professions.
Yes, indeed.
Now that makes me kind of curious to think about with that tribal culture, because now we are seeing in the global arena that there are a lot of immigration and acculturation happening. Do you think in medical education that's the feasibility, or do you think that sticking to one tribe and one tribal culture is a better way to move forward?
If you're asking about interdisciplinary practices of teams, not crossing geographical, cultural boundaries.
Yes.
Okay. This is a very important concept. Too often, medicine assumes priority in those. And the acculturation of people into, let's say, orthopedics, because I lived there and worked there for 10 years, is a culture of selectivity of, it's very hard to get a residency in orthopedics in North America. And so they consider themselves often as the best and the brightest. Well, that doesn't work on a team they also sometimes fall back on, well, the legal responsibility falls on my shoulders, particularly in the US, where there is litigation. And it's right to be cautious and concerned about those things. But those things intrude upon the kind of teamwork that is necessary for a mix of professions to care for patients in one way or another. And I think Lorelei Lingard has done some really good work on that with Brian Hodges. Well, Lorelei in particular has talked about teams and having team competence and knowing when you don't know something well enough being open more often than not for there being another voice, another opinion, and so forth. That team competence is something I don't really see very, very often, but it is surely the necessary condition for it to move forward now as interdisciplinary teams.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think as we move forward, I think more conversations are needed on that domain, because I think it doesn't matter which continent you work. I think the tribes, they manifest the similar traits. The orthopedic surgeon in North America and orthopedic surgeon in Australia or in sub, they behave in the same fashion. I think the education is also similar.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you brought that concept quite nicely, that about thinking about team competence. And I think we all should reflect upon that whether we teach on that lines in our disciplines.
Okay.
Now, Prof, you're very well known about the concept of plurality of good teaching, and you have challenged the notion of a singular orthodoxy of good teaching. Now, it's pretty hard to understand, so can you help us?
Well, I'd be glad to. This one is something as you know, I'm really given to. I wrote a piece on this called One Size Fits All, ? And then went on with this. But it really came out of three different things. First of all, an experience I had that was devastating. Secondly, a conceptual framework from Lee Shulman a long time ago. And then some confirmatory data that is gathered in the first 100,000 people that have taken the teaching perspectives inventory. So let me back up and tell you the story of my own experience that was very convincing to me that there has to be a plurality of the good in teaching. I was up for promotion at my university, the University of British Columbia, and the procedure is that someone comes in and observes you for one class, and they look at your syllabus and all those sorts of things. So this fellow, I will call him John, this fellow came in and observed a 3-hour class that I was teaching. There were about 18 students in the class. It was a graduate class, and we were studying different learning theories and how these different theories of learning spoke to them from whence they came. Some of them were international students, some of them were working in health professions, some in other kinds of adult education. So when he finished observing my class, he said to me, Dan, could we meet for coffee, perhaps tomorrow, to discuss this? And what can you say? I've said, sure, John, I'd be glad to. So I went to the coffee shop at the prearranged time and place, sat there, and John came in. I stood up and shook his hand, and we sat down. And the first words out of his mouth, these I remember so well. He turned to me and he said, Dan, do you think your students are getting their money's worth? Well, I was dumbstruck. I didn't know why he would ask that. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, they were asking questions, and I know you have answers, but you turned it back to them. And I think that's a waste of time. Well, okay, so without going into my rationale for doing that year I won the teaching award for the entire university. And he also had been an award-winning teacher at the same university. So it struck me that, number one, he was coming in and looking for some semblance of himself when he observed my teaching. But number two, we were both good teachers. It just happened that one more senior member was making a judgment about a junior member. So that was the start of it. And then I went overseas to work in a number of different countries, and I saw that there was good teaching of many kinds. The second part of my convincing that there is a plurality of the good comes from Lee Shulman. Lee Shulman was a faculty member at Michigan State University in Michigan and then at Stanford in California. But he became the president of the Carnegie Institute for Higher Education. And he wrote this short piece on signature pedagogies. And the notion behind that was that we teach people in the professions like law and medicine and ministries and things like that. We teach them very much as we practice those professions. And I thought, well, that's interesting because I've observed a number of teachers teaching law and other disciplines, and they have their own ways. And then I've lived in China, and they have their own ways. And lived in Mexico for a while, they have their own ways. So there are signature pedagogies, so conceptually it makes sense. But then, more recently, in the first 100,000 people that had taken the Teaching Perspectives Inventory, my former colleague who died 5 years ago, he did an analysis of 25,000 health professionals who had taken the Teaching Perspectives Inventory, and they had 5 or more years of teaching experience in their profession, in their specialty. And we plotted that against a normative distribution of 100,000 people. And we could see very clearly there were normative differences between the medical specialties, 5 different medical specialties, between 5 different disciplines at the university, and other health professions. So I was convinced that my initial piece, avoiding a new orthodoxy because we would be doing injustice to someone, is the right idea. So the central message of my work is that effective teaching is cultural, situational, and personal. And therefore, there must be a plurality of good rather than a singular orthodoxy of good teaching.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks for simplifying complex concept. And I like the idea about these signature pedagogies. And what are your findings from your research that what things help to shape those signatures and how one signature can look more beautiful than others?
Well, I must back up. I didn't say anyone looked more beautiful than the others. They just look different from each other. You know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I have data for medicine, internal medicine, family practice, emergency medicine, orthopedics, general surgery. I think each of them sees beauty in their own profile because their signature profile, pedagogical signature, matches their own personal profile. And so when they see that they're a member of their own community, that it's differentiated from other communities, they see that as quite beautiful, or at least acceptable. But, and this is a project that we were starting, there are outliers in each of those. So, for example, in orthopedics, I was a member of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons in their educators course for about a decade. And when they would take this instrument, the one person in the group that didn't look like the normative signature, pedagogical signature, came up to me in each session we did each year, and he would complain about that. And I said, well, so I would explain what his profile meant. And he said, now I see why it is my partner in orthopedics and I don't agree about teaching. I see where we differ now. So it wasn't beautiful to him, but it was certainly revealing to him.
No, okay. So I like that idea about where your pedagogical profile matches your personal profile. You mentioned in previous answer multiple times about teaching perspective inventory. Now, if you can take us deeper into this and help us to understand what is this concept and why budding educators should undertake this exercise.
Sure. The inventory arose out of an initial study that my graduate students and I did across 5 years in 5 different countries, where we observed and interviewed 254 different teachers of adults in different disciplines and professions, including health professions. And out of that, my colleague John Collins and I built this inventory in the year 2000. And there are 2 reasons that people might think about taking it, amongst others. There are many reasons for taking it, but 2 that are very common is to learn, first of all, to learn who you are as a teacher and be able to articulate that in ways you haven't been able to articulate it before. And secondly, to facilitate conversations about teaching across different kinds of commitments to teaching or different pedagogical profiles. So there are lots of reasons within those. So, for example, to learn about who you are as a teacher, any teacher can be misread by just simply watching them teach. Their actions do not speak clearly, as in the case of my own evaluation of my teaching. So I think to be better understood, you need to know how to articulate the nature of yourself as teacher before you're being evaluated, or even to your learners, to your students. If you're working with residents, it may be useful to tell them, what are you really trying to accomplish? Why do you think that's important? And how will we go about that? Also, in order to reflect on our teaching, we're advised to do this a lot. And I think a lot of it comes out of Donald Schoen's work in the early 1980s, the reflective practitioner and educating the reflective practitioner. But it's difficult for people to say, well, what am I to reflect upon? I'm not sure. If reflection is looking in a mirror and seeing myself come back, do I just see the physical object of myself, or do I just see the actions I've taken? How should I read more deeply into the reflection that I make? And so the TPI, the Teaching Perspectives Inventory, can help people look more deeply as well as give them a language for that. But it's critical, if you're being evaluated, to be able to tell your evaluators something about yourself as teacher. And of course, if you're working across different commitments of teaching, even within your own discipline, it's useful to be able to have a language that doesn't make some people bad and other people good. Think of teaching as composed of 4 pedagogical acts. There's an intellectual act, wherein our teaching deals with claims to truth. We all do that. We all have claims to truth about health, about teaching, about anything we're dealing with. And that's a lot of what people have to learn. Secondly, there's a relational act, because if you're a teacher and you have learners, you're in interdependent roles and responsibilities. And so the relationship is very important. We know that for feedback, for example. But third, there is a moral act in teaching as well, because teaching requires proprietary judgments about what is of value and what is of worth, and when is it all right to not know. And then fourthly, there is a cultural act, because claims to truth, relationships, and proprietary judgments are culturally and historically constituted by others and then reconstituted by us as we become members of a particular culture or specialty. So we may be committed to all four, and people will say they are. But in fact, they are not equally committed to all four. The 254 teachers that we studied emphasized one act more than any others. They worked towards particular intentions and goals. And so they emphasized one of these more than the others. It's not that the others weren't there, it's just that they were secondary or even quite distant from their primary act as a teacher. So I think the TPI helps name where you are in those acts, what it is you're given to, what it is you're committed to. And having given it name and having given it language to talk about it, we can have different commitments to different acts and still talk civilized to each other about teaching and help each other. So conversations are better when we understand other people's commitments as well as our own.
Thanks, Prof. It's quite fascinating. Thanks for helping us to understand this complex concept. Now, I like the way that you put it across that teaching is an intellectual act, relational act, moral act, and cultural act. And for I think budding educator is really important to find out where their kind of commitment is. Now, as you mentioned that not every single person will be committed to all four acts equally. Do you think that they kind of change over the period of time as you progress in your teaching career? What's your observation so far?
They can, and some do tremendously, but not everybody does. I would say a minority of people change which act is most prominent in their teaching. But I can give you an example of one of those in orthopedics. The fellow that brought me into orthopedics had done his master's degree with me while he was going through his residency. And so he and I became good friends, and he brought me into the educator's course for the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. He started off in emphasizing the relational act, very much so. But over the years, he has migrated and now is very dominant in the cultural act because he is trying to change the culture of healthcare in America now. And he is critiquing and writing about it, as well as training his residents to think critically about the taken for granted in healthcare in the US, especially surgery. So he migrated across over time. It doesn't happen quickly. And we've done longitudinal studies with people. For the most part, unless we're trying to change something, there's another instance of that. A woman that I worked with, a lot of the people are stand and deliver, and she was uncomfortable with that and got terrible evaluations. And so when we talked about it over and over again, she decided that she really was given to relationships and building relationships, not just with her students, but with her students building relationships with healthcare providers. And so she just revamped everything, and 3 years later won the teaching award. So I think finding where you are is also a way of changing in there.
Okay, that's again quite interesting. And I think what I'm hearing is the teaching perspective inventory is more of a tool for reflection and understand where you are, who you are, and what you do from there.
Yes.
If the budding educator wants to undertake this exercise, what's the link and how can they access?
The site is on Teaching Perspectives, one word, no spaces, teachingperspectives.com. But I think just putting in the Teaching Perspectives inventory, you'll get to it.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for sharing your valuable insights. Now, what's your advice to budding educators?
Have a conversation with a trusted colleague about teaching. Too often we don't talk about our teaching. Find someone with whom you can talk openly about your teaching and that they are interested in talking about their teaching, maybe more than one. You might take the TPI and discuss each of your results, especially if you're teaching the same thing to similar people. I think the second thing would be to live up to the motto, less can be more. Too often, junior people try to impress with how much they know. And honestly, learners will forget much of what you said, but they will never, ever forget how you made them feel. And so I think forming a relationship with learners that is trusting is very good. My Aunt Vivian, when I was just out of university and starting to be a teacher, she was a teacher for 40 years, and she said to me, Dan, start off firm and fair. You can be friendly later. I think that's pretty good. And I think you were in my session in May, and I have to say, one other thing is when things go bad, and they always, not always, they will sometime. When things go bad, it's never as bad as you thought it was. But of course, if you believe that, and you should, when things go terrific and you think you were just a star, it's never as good as you thought it was. So temper both of those.
Such a valuable advice. And can't keep appreciating you that every time I speak with you, I learn so many new things.
This has been fun.
I agree. That was really, really great fun. So thanks, Rolf. Thanks for spending your valuable time with us.
Well, and thank you for doing this with so many people. And I've listened to some of them. They're really good. So thank you for your work too.
Thank you very much.
All right.
So thanks, folks. That was the end of our today's episode. Thanks for listening to Educators Podcast. If you like what you just heard, I hope that you will pass along our web address www.critcareedu.com.au to your friends and colleagues, and please leave us a positive review on iTunes. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts, and don't forget to join us in month's time for another edition of Educators Podcast. Till then, goodbye and have a nice time.